Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Mindy Crawford. I'm the Executive Director of Preservation Pennsylvania. We are the statewide advocacy voice for historic preservation, helping people protect and preserve the historic places that they love. We work to ensure that legislation, policies, and programs support the work of preserving our past. Our webinar today is in partnership with Preservation Pittsburgh, a community-based advocacy organization that believes everyone deserves a voice in preserving the city of Pittsburgh. Our free webinar is made possible by our members and donors. Neither organization receives government funding for operations. We rely on passionate folks like you to support our work. Thank you to those of you who are already members or donors of either organization or both organizations. If not, please consider supporting us through membership or a donation. We'll put links to both organizations in the chat box. Pittsburgh Immaculate Conception Church was added to Preservation Pennsylvania's at-risk list in 2022 after the church was closed by the Archdiocese of Pittsburgh. Assuming the church remains closed, the building faces several challenges, including intense development pressure in the neighborhood, pressing maintenance issues, and the challenges of finding an appropriate reuse. Shortly, you will hear from speakers who will talk a little bit about the church and also the efforts to save, reuse, preserve not just this church, but other church buildings. During the presentation, you can type your questions in the chat box or use the question and answer function. You'll find both of those at the bottom of your screen. After the presentation and discussion among our speakers is completed, we will try to answer as many of your questions as possible. Now I'd like to introduce Brittany Riley, Preservation Pittsburgh board member and chair of the Pittsburgh Modern Committee, to introduce our speakers.
Thank you so much, Mindy, and welcome everyone. I'll just share a bit about our presenters, Greg and Joshua, and then let them get to the good part. So Greg Weimer-Skirch is an architect and production designer for feature films and television. He's a 1982 graduate of Immaculate Conception Grade School and was a member of the congregation at Immaculate Conception Church for more than 2 decades. His grandfather, Dominic Pronio, was vice chair of the building committee, which raised money to build the new church that you'll learn about today in the 1950s. The church building was a major influence on Greg, ultimately leading him to study architecture and set design and motion pictures. He has designed and art directed a number of well-known films that will be familiar to you, including A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood and Fences. And Greg has been a very powerful and important advocate for the design and presence of this church. So thank you, Greg. And Joshua Castano is Director of Special Initiatives at Partners for Sacred Places, based in Philadelphia. They are a non-sectarian, nonprofit organization dedicated to sound stewardship and active community use of older sacred places across America. Since his childhood, he has had a passion for helping people discover the beauty and significance of our cultural and architectural heritage. His studies were in art and architectural history at Oberlin College, and then continued into his career in historic preservation, combining engagement with community development and grassroots organizing, as well as institutional networking. He moved to Philadelphia in 2013 when he joined Partners for Sacred Places, finding an alignment with his passion and the mission of the organization, and has built his career and breadth of knowledge, experience across the organization. He is currently the Director of Special Initiatives, and this reflects his experience in developing new programs and leading innovative efforts to support congregations across the nation. Joshua and Greg, thank you so much, and we will begin with Greg's presentation on the church design.
Well, thank you everybody for giving up some time on a Sunday to find out a little bit about Immaculate Conception Church in Pittsburgh. I just want to make sure, can everyone see the presentation and not me? All right. Before I begin, I want to thank Mindy Crawford and Sabra Smith at Preservation Pennsylvania for organizing this webinar. but I especially want to thank them and the selection committee of Preservation PA for placing Immaculate Conception Church on the 2022 Pennsylvania at-risk list. Placing the church on the list brings much needed attention to this amazing modern building. I also want to thank Melissa McSwing and Brittany Riley of Preservation Pittsburgh for helping to guide me through the preservation process. And a very special thank you to Amy Fisher, who is also from Preservation Pittsburgh, who took many of the transcendent photographs of the church that will appear in this presentation. And finally, thank you to Joshua Castano from Partners for Sacred Places for joining us today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the closing of Immaculate Conception is being petitioned by a group of parishioners with the Vatican in Rome. A decision is expected within the next month or two. It is my hope that they are successful because there is no better use for this building, which was so thoughtfully designed and executed, than for it to remain a house of worship. This presentation will help to illustrate the uniqueness of the church architecture in the hope that the building will be saved from possible demolition and repurposed in the event that the Vatican decides not to reopen the church. I also want to note at the outset that my association with the church goes back to my birth. Well, even a little before then. My grandparents, as Brittany had mentioned just a moment ago, Betty and Dominic Pronio were heavily involved in raising money to build the new church. My grandfather especially spent several years going door to door to campaign for the construction fund. My grandfather also served on the building committee and helped to select the architects and contractors for the building. His copy of the 1963 dedication booklet, as well as his recorded words, provided valuable information on the history of the building of the new church. In addition to having such loving grandparents, as Brittany mentioned, I attended Immaculate Conception School and graduated in 1982. The building has provided much inspiration in my life and work. So a little geographic context and background for those of you not from Pittsburgh. The church is located in Bloomfield, a distinct neighborhood of about 8,500 residents in Pittsburgh's East End. It lies about 3 miles from the confluence of Pittsburgh's three rivers and the downtown core. Historically, Bloomfield has been a tight-knit, working-class Italian neighborhood, consisting mostly of small row houses on narrow streets. West Penn Hospital, a major employer in the East End, dominates the Bloomfield skyline and is seen here in the upper portion of the photo. Immaculate Conception Church sits about a half block away from the hospital and is conspicuous in design, to say the least, compared to its neighbors. Bloomfield has a relatively healthy main street, Liberty Avenue, which is the main shopping area for the neighborhood, as well as a destination for those who live in the East End. As with many neighborhoods in Pittsburgh and in other cities, the community is changing, for better or worse, depending on your point of view, as older generations make way for the new. However, one thing has been constant in Bloomfield throughout its history: it has remained a healthy and desirable place to live. Bloomfield was annexed to the city of Pittsburgh in 1868, and the area was first settled by German Catholic immigrants who built St. Joseph's Church in 1872 on Liberty Avenue. Italians from the Abruzzi region would also settle in the area, and by the turn of the 20th century would form Immaculate Conception Parish. Both parishes grew rapidly and would operate their own elementary schools, with Immaculate Conception's only recently closing in 2020 after more than 100 years of service. St. Joseph's Elementary School closed in the early 1980s. Immaculate Conception constructed its first church building in 1906 on Edmund Street and Corday Way in a simplified Gothic revival style. In 2012, with dwindling congregations, St. Joseph's, Immaculate Conception, and St. Lawrence O'Toole which is located in the adjacent Garfield neighborhood, were merged to form St. Maria Goretti Parish. St. Lawrence O'Toole, which also had a modern 1960s church building, was demolished in April 2022. Stained glass windows by Pittsburgh artist Milko Silanov were removed prior to demolition and were placed for sale at a local architectural salvage yard. Assuming that Immaculate Conception is not reopened by the Vatican, St. Maria Goretti Parish will worship in St. Joseph's Church on Liberty Avenue. The original Immaculate Conception Church of 1906 was damaged by a fire in 1925. It was rebuilt and expanded to accommodate the growing Catholic population of Bloomfield. By the mid-1950s, with the post-war baby boom in full swing, the parish had outgrown the church once again. In 1957, it was decided that a new church would be built on the same site as the old church. The parish would purchase the Plaza Theater on Liberty Avenue, which is where the Starbucks is located today, a mere stone's throw from the existing church, and convert the auditorium into a temporary worship site while the new church was constructed. The pastor of Immaculate Conception, Father Albert Farina, pictured here with his 4 brothers, all of whom were priests in the Catholic Diocese of Pittsburgh. This is an interesting story, by the way, and would make for a great presentation on some other occasion. Father Farina was dealing with a congregation that was busting at the seams. He had recently expanded the grain school and now had to contend with building a new church. He desperately needed an architect. Father Farina, who also had an interest in architecture, would attend a Catholic conference on church design in Brazil. On the plane trip to Rio, he serendipitously met Ido Belli of Chicago, who just happened to be an architect of Catholic churches. I need to tell you that I only found out about this chance meeting between Ido and Father Farina just 2 weeks ago, when Jim Belli, the son of Ido Belli, who is also an architect, returned a phone call that I had made to him from last April. He was headed out of the country and will be back in a couple of weeks, and I look forward to talking with him soon about the Bellis and their work. Jim stated that both Ido and Father Farina had hit it off, and at the end of the conference, Father Farina told Ido that he wanted him to design a new church for his congregation. In 1958, the Bellis met with members of the church's building committee. As my grandfather Dominic recounted, not only were they talented architects, they were also Italian. Of course, they were hired on the spot. The church was designed by brothers Ido Belli, who passed away in 2003, and Anthony Belli, who passed away in 2007. The brothers formed a lasting relationship with Chicago Archbishop Samuel Sturridge early in their career, and won numerous commissions for churches and schools in the Chicago Archdiocese. This association would bring them many commissions from the Catholic Church around the country. The scope of work the firm produced is vast, although not well documented. Ido had a gregarious and warm personality, according to my grandfather, and served as the primary designer for the firm's project, while his brother Anthony, a licensed engineer, worked on the more pragmatic aspects of building design. Belli practiced in nearly every state in the US, including designing several more churches in the Pittsburgh area, Madonna de Castillo in Swissville and Mother of Sorrows in McKees Rocks. The firm had a staff of nearly 50 architects for most of its existence. The Bellis even had their own airplane and pilot on staff, as Ido was thoroughly involved in the design of every building and was often on site during construction. In my recent conversation with Jim Belli, he said that he had a photo of Ido standing on top of one of the concrete arches at Immaculate Conception during construction. I can't wait to get my hands on that photograph. By the time the brothers had retired, they had designed over 1,200 buildings, many of which were churches and schools, all of which were eclectic in design. I should note, according to Jim Belly, that Ito had a falling out with the American Institute of Architects in Chicago early in his career and left the organization. This may explain why the firm is not more widely known or published. As we dive into the design of Immaculate Conception, I think it's important to understand the period in architecture in which the church was conceived and built. It is common to refer to anything designed in the mid-20th century as mid-century modern, but the period had many interesting subsets and movements. I believe that Immaculate Conception was designed in the expressionist manner. In a 1983 interview with the Art Institute of Chicago, Ito Belli mentioned his desire to break with traditional architecture and to design buildings that express a deeper meaning for their use and to transcend style, time, and place. This is a tenet of Expressionism, a movement that emerged in Northern Europe in the early 20th century, primarily in poetry and painting, where it attempted to distort reality to express emotional experience. Some architects of the 1950s and 60s adopted this ideology and used materials such as stone, concrete, and glass to create novel sculptural forms and massing. Often, Expressionism involved a rejection of historical styles and traditional design motifs and instead embraced abstraction. This tended to result in unusual building forms using innovative construction techniques that often stood out from their surroundings. Notable examples of the style include the Sydney Opera House, which was pictured previously, the TWA terminal at JFK Airport, and the Gateway Arch in St. Louis. Ito Belli specifically mentioned his admiration for Eero Saarinen, who designed the Gateway Arch in the TWA building, among many other projects. You'll note the similarity in the design of the Gateway Arch to the arches at Immaculate Conception in the forthcoming images. Taking a look at the church site in its context, this plat map from 1924 shows the siting of the 1906 church, as well as several small buildings which house the school. The current school building was not built until 1940. The church is located on Edmund Street and Corday Way. Note that the church only occupies a portion of the site. In this contemporary Google Map image, we can see the outline of the old church superimposed over the current church building. Pelley and Belli had a demanding building program, which required them to make use of every available square foot of space. This would become a guiding principle in the design of the church. Note also that Edmund Street has been abandoned. The city of Pittsburgh and the church would partner to build a new public parking lot, as well as gain a much needed playground for the growing school. In this photograph from the church's dedication, you can see that Edmund Street is still in use. Also note the proximity to Liberty Avenue. The church is only a half block away from the main street of the neighborhood. It would be 2 years before Edmund Street would be vacated. The exterior of Immaculate Conception features a central 25-foot tall entrance vestibule, or narthex, composed of glass and aluminum, which is arranged in a convex form. Two principal facades, each composed of 3 concrete arches, which resemble the St. Louis Arch, extend out from the entrance. These facades crown the south and west naves and incorporate 40-foot tall stained glass windows. A circular 2-story baptistry clad in stone to the right of the entrance punctuates the glass facade and is capped with a stylized crucifix of approximately 50 feet in height. Unusual for the time, the church contains 2 naves, which together seat nearly 1,000 parishioners. One of the deceiving things about the church's design is just how large the building is. Its massing is skillfully broken down to conceal its volume. Also novel for the time was the separation of the baptistry from the baptismal font from the main altar. The baptistry is in effect its own chapel and can be used separately while other church services are conducted. The interior of the church is arranged into 6 distinct spaces: the narthex, baptistry, shrine chapels, west nave, south nave, and the altar. The plan is organized so that the parishioner is always focused on the altar, tabernacle, and mosaic reredos. 2 groups of towering stained glass windows, the west-facing creation window and the south-facing judgment window, shower each nave with colored light without distracting from the altar. The volume of space in the naves is articulated in a forced perspective manner to keep focus on the altar. Beginning from the highest point of the stained glass windows at 40 feet, the barrel vaulted ceilings and walls gradually taper inward and converge upon the altar and mosaic. The floating ceiling above the altar is reduced to a height of approximately 25 feet above the altar. It's probably a little easier to understand in section, especially when you consider that the building had a concave effect. That is, the walls and the barrel vaults, which taper in, are clad in tens of thousands of small circular ceramic tiles, which gradually progress from darker earth tones at the stained glass windows to lighter tones at the walls near the altar, suggesting enlightenment. The curved wall behind the altar and mosaic is completely white and composed of the same circular ceramic tiles. As we begin to look at images of the church's interior, it's important to note that the building suffers from deferred maintenance, as many churches do with dwindling congregations. You'll see that the roof is leaking and the plaster is failing in certain areas. The walls of the church are also quite dirty. The dirt is from decades of burning wax candles. There used to be hundreds of votive candles at the base of the stained glass windows, as well as in other areas of the church. The church was also renovated in 1989, and the floating ceiling above the altar was changed, and several skylights and original recessed lighting were removed. These were integral to the spiritual qualities of the design and were removed in favor of adding additional heating and air conditioning. This was probably done as it was the most cost-effective way to do so at the time. Also changed were the original mid-century pendant lights and carpeting. The original white columns and ceramic tile that surrounded the altar were also painted over rather than being cleaned. In my opinion, all of these modifications are reversible if the church is reopened or restored. I produced a simple 3D model to help illustrate the original design. These images, along with historical photographs from the church dedication, will supplement the contemporary photographs presented. This is the west nave today. You can see the mosaic at the altar, and the ceiling, you can see how it has been altered as well. Where the vents are, used to be a series of skylights. There was a large oculus skylight, which is probably about 6 to 8 feet in diameter, directly above the statue of Jesus. And at certain times of the day, the sun would stream through the skylight and highlight, at the time, what was a crucifix, or in this case, the statue of Jesus. You can also see that the church replaced the lighting fixtures and the carpeting. Here again is a closer image of the original altar with its original crucifix. You can see how in the mosaic, the width of the cross is reflected in the design of the mosaic. And here we are, a closer view of the altar. Again, getting a closer look at what has changed. Here also we can see.
Greg,
Yes.
your slides are not advancing.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me try. Okay, is that working now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. So here you can see some of the damage that's occurring with the need for a new roof. There are water stains behind the altar, and the plaster ceiling is failing. But some of the cool aspects of the design, the communion rail, again, getting back to the St. Louis arch, as well as the furniture, and of course, the mosaic. Here is an original shot from the dedication of the church. Again, you can see the interesting furniture that was custom designed for the church. I should note also that the altar itself is a 1.5 ton piece of white Carrara marble.
Your
Carved from
slides are not advancing again. I'm sorry. There you go.
my computer is a bit delayed, sorry. So here again, you can see the furniture that was custom designed for the church, and the custom altar piece, which is made from a piece of 1.5 ton white Carrara marble. And there is the original crucifix. Looking back towards the judgment window in the south nave, you can see the original pendant lighting and the interesting shadows that it projected onto the ceiling. It created a very dramatic experience for the interior. Also note the interesting design of the pulpit, all of which actually is still there and intact. This is a rare photo showing the floating ceiling above the altar with the oculus and skylights intact. You can also see that there was a band of fluorescent lighting around that floating ceiling piece, which kind of gave the altar a sort of heavenly appearance. And again, you can see that the skylights are illuminated. What's also interesting is that the larger oculus skylight is sort of reflected into the mosaic. You can see these communion hosts radiating out from the tabernacle just under the cross. All of that works in tandem to create a pretty remarkable building. In addition to the unique architectural features of the church, the design also incorporates innovative structural engineering for the period of construction. As described in the dedication booklet by co-architect Anthony Belli, the church is constructed of formed reinforced concrete, or thin shell concrete construction. Ito and Anthony chose concrete so they could span great distances to obtain unobstructed views of the altar. The impressive engineering for the church is perhaps most evident at the intersection of each nave and the altar directly above the choir loft. I've highlighted the structural components with a blue dash. It is at this point that the nearly 150-foot long span of the south nave and the 75-foot span of the west nave seemingly collide in midair with no means of visible support. And here is a great picture from the altar that shows the structural gymnastics that were accomplished in this building. Also note that there are skylights in the choir loft. Those were removed as well in 1989. Here is a view of the south nave. To the left, you see a series of doors. These are the confessionals for the church. There are 6 of them on this side and 6 in the west nave as well. You can also see the floating or projecting choir loft. And here is a view of from the same view. The truly monumental stained glass windows of Immaculate Conception Church are undoubtedly its most significant feature. The windows measure nearly 40 feet tall, about 4 stories at their highest point in the center of each nave. The judgment window in the south nave is 68 feet wide at its base, and the creation window in the west nave is 59 feet wide. The creation and judgment windows were designed by Roy Callaghan of the Hunt Stained Glass Studios in Pittsburgh. Roy was design director at Hunt Studio until he left the firm in 1967 to open his own practice. Roy previously worked for the August Miller Studio and the Conrad Schmidt Studios. Both firms designed much of the church's statuary and furnishings. Nicholas Perendo, who joined Hunt Studio in 1950s, designed the baptistry windows as well as the etched glass entry doors that were installed during the 1989 church renovation. Nicholas purchased the studio in 1987 and was chief designer at the studio until his death in 2016. Hunt Stained Glass Studios is still in operation and is now owned by Nicholas's children, David and Celeste. And David has confirmed that the original drawings for the windows are in the Hunt Studio archive. The windows were created in the Dalle de Verre technique developed by artist Jean Gaudin in Paris in the 1930s. The method utilizes 1-inch thick pieces of colored glass, which are chipped at the edges or faceted to increase their brilliance. Once the glass is cut, the pieces are arranged in a wooden form. An epoxy resin is then poured onto the form to set the glass in place. The resulting panels are then combined together to create the window. So this is different from a lot of stained glass windows that you see that use lead and solder to bring the pieces of glass together. This is actually in a resin or concrete-like material. The creation window in the west nave illustrates the story of Adam and Eve and the beginning of life on earth. Its composition utilizes horizontal bands of blue, yellow, and red glass set in an abstract and angular pattern. The hand of God is illustrated on the left, reaching out to Adam and Eve in the center window. The sun, stars, trees, and various animals are dispersed throughout the composition, representing abundance in the newborn world. The judgment window in the south nave illustrates the second coming of Jesus Christ. Vertical swaths of blue, purple, and orange glass are used in contrast to the horizontal red and gold bands of the creation window. The blue glass represents the water of life, nourishing the faithful. Serpents in the water, as well as Satan, which is illustrated by a dragon in the window on the right, are visually overpowered by the descending Christ. The church's statuary, including the bas-relief panels of the Stations of the Cross, which align each nave of the church, were designed by Fred Gentile of the Conrad Schmidt Studios in New Berlin, Wisconsin. They were carved from lindenwood by Vinicio Mussner in Otella, Italy. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. The statues were originally finished in a gold toned lacquer, but were repainted in color during the 1989 renovation. The statuary lamp, tabernacle, and altar furniture were designed by the Conrad Schmidt Studios and fabricated by Johann Schilter of West Berlin, Germany. The mosaic pictured on the, which will be coming up on the next slide, was designed by Bernhard Grunkel of Conrad Schmidt Studios and also fabricated by the August Wagner Company in West Berlin, Germany. The altar mosaic was designed again by Fred Grunkel and fabricated by the August Wagner Company of West Berlin, Germany. The mosaic contains thousands of tiles ranging from 3/8 of an inch to 2 inches square in size. The gold mosaics were made by placing 24-karat gold lead between 2 sheets of glass. The theme of the mosaic is the Apostles' Creed. The hand of God is illustrated to the left of Jesus, with the Holy Spirit represented by a dove at his right. Jesus is in the center. Again, the statue replaced a wooden crucifix in the 1989 renovation. Circles representing the Holy Host radiate out from the tabernacle. The words, "I believe" and "Life everlasting, amen," bookend the mosaic. I can tell you as a young child attending service at this church, there's nothing more powerful than seeing something like this and seeing the words, "I believe." Here are some historic images, again, from the dedication of the church, showing the baptistry with its original baptismal font, the doors to the baptistry, the small photo on the left, and the stairway to the choir above. Beneath the choir loft is two shrines. One is the St. Anthony Shrine, and the other is the Sorrowful Mother Shrine, again with statuary created by the August Wagner Company. Here is the narthex or vestibule today. That is the original cross that was on the mosaic originally. And here is a shot from the dedication of the building. You'll note that there is a house across the street when you look out the window, and you'll see some cars. This was obviously taken before the church had bought those houses and removed them. So the threat to Immaculate Conception Church is urgent. A structural report issued to the church's advisory council determined that although the building is currently sound, a new roof is urgently needed. As mentioned earlier, roof leaks have caused ceiling plaster to fail in several areas, and cracks have developed in the ceramic tiles around the choir loft and at the base of the barrel vaults. If not addressed soon, these problems will begin to compromise the structure. In addition to the physical state of the building, Bloomfield and the east end of Pittsburgh have seen significant development pressure in the past 2 decades as the area changes and gentrifies. There is strong demand for developable land. As illustrated here, the church is part of a campus that includes a convent, a large 3-story school building, a playground, and small parking area. As assembled, these elements alone will provide a highly desirable development site. The campus also sits next to a large public parking lot that is owned by the city of Pittsburgh. It's not unreasonable to assume that the parking lot could be included with the church property to create a substantial development parcel, although public parking would have to be contained within the new development. Furthermore, the church campus is only a half block away from the Western Pennsylvania Hospital, which has already amassed neighboring properties for future development. Finally, the Diocese of Pittsburgh requires the removal of all religious objects, with no exception. In 1996, St. John the Baptist Church in the Lawrenceville neighborhood of Pittsburgh was sold by the diocese and adapted into a brew pub. At the time, the diocese did not remove the stained glass windows or murals from the church. The owners of the brew pub kept the windows and placed the beer fermentation vessels on the altar. Although striking in design for the brew pub, it understandably upset the diocese. Since then, all religious artifacts must be removed from a church upon closure. And in Bishop Zubik's letter announcing the decree of closing for the church, it does in fact state that all articles of artistic value should be removed from the church. Adaptive reuse will be a challenge for Immaculate Conception, but it's not impossible. A potential redevelopment would reuse the school and rectory for housing, while the church could be converted into a community event space or some other resource. It also could become a collaborative office space for one of the many tech companies seeking space in Pittsburgh. In some ways, you could simply remove all the pews and put in workstations, and you would have a very dramatic environment. Perhaps an even bolder vision is required, such as a satellite gallery for the Carnegie Museum of Art, or a studio for another arts-based organization, such as the Pittsburgh Glass Center. There are many examples in Pittsburgh of reusing older buildings for new uses, including churches, the Priory on Pittsburgh's north side, and the Union Project in Highland Park, to name but a few. There are also stunning examples of church conversions around the globe. Some of them are pictured here. They managed to preserve the best features of the original architecture while adapting it to a new use. Buildings of the recent past are easily disregarded without consideration for architectural merit or community sentiment. Structures that are between 50 and 75 years old are particularly vulnerable. They are neither too old or they are neither too young nor too old to be appropriately appreciated. Immaculate Conception Church is worthy of preservation and should be adapted to a new use if the building is not reopened by the Vatican. There are many reasons to landmark Immaculate Conception Church, and here are my top criteria. Number one, the church is a unique expression of architecture, a singular work of sculpture that is site-specific and custom-tailored to use. It was designed by Italian-American architects whose body of work, especially for the Catholic Church, is now beginning to be recognized. Number two, the church contains significant works of art produced by a team of international artisans. Many of these artworks are directly integrated into the building structure, including the monumental stained glass windows and the ultra mosaic, which contains the many 24-karat gold lead tiles. Number three, the church was built by the efforts of hundreds of first and second generation Italian Americans, including its pastor, Alfred Farina. The church is the embodiment of a unique moment in time and expresses the spiritual aspirations of a generation now past. And number four, finally, in a culture that so easily disregards everything, it is environmentally sound to save older, interesting buildings. The best green building is the one that already exists. I'd like to end the presentation with a quote from Cardinal John J. Wright, who was Bishop of Pittsburgh at the time of the church's dedication in 1961. He said, "The new Immaculate Conception Church, with all of its uniqueness and functional requirements of the modern age, is a structure that inspires spiritual devotion comparable to the great cathedrals." Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Greg. We'd like to now ask Joshua to join us to share his remarks.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I'm pleased to be part of this. And I'm so glad that there are folks who have wonderful, rich connections to this property, like Greg, and that there are so many people who feel passionately about the future of this incredible building. I have to say that I think it is a stunning property. And even though I've been in Pittsburgh many times, I've not had the chance to see this building in person. But from what I've learned over the past week or so in preparation for today, I am really quite impressed with the level of artistic accomplishment in this building. It is certainly an important and valuable landmark for the neighborhood of Bloomfield and the city of Pittsburgh. Of course, adapting churches can be tricky, and it is an important question for the future, especially as we know the religious landscape is changing in somewhat dramatic fashion, exacerbated in pace and scale by the recent years of the pandemic, which have really continued to make some of those challenges even harder for faith communities across the country. And the Roman Catholic Church, while experiencing growth in many parts of the country, those parts of the country are not the Midwest and the Northeast, where attendance and participation in the church continue to shrink, and resulting in many places and many of the large archdioceses of the United States, like Chicago, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh, with many closures of Catholic schools, Catholic institutions of religious life, and parish churches and their properties. Before I continue, I just want to say a little bit more about Partners for Sacred Places. And I thank Brittany for the wonderful introduction. Partners has been around since 1989. And as she mentioned, we are a national non-sectarian nonprofit, which is really important aspect of our identity in that it gives us the freedom and the ability to work carefully and in partnership with people and leaders of all religious traditions. And that's a very important part. We also see ourselves sort of as bridge builders between religious communities and religious leaders and the wider community. And one of the key ways that we build that bridge is by emphasizing the value of these places, and not just for their architecture and not just for their beauty and their history, but also for the ways that they welcome and serve community through all the events, the cultural events, the human and social service events that take place in them, and their potential to do that, even if we're talking about a closed space. So that's really key for us. Partners has a number of programs for congregations and also other groups that are trying to preserve historic houses of worship. We have programs like the National Fund for Sacred Places, which is a program for eligible congregations across the country that provides capital grants between $50,000 and $250,000. It's a highly competitive but really great program that we're proud to do in partnership with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. But we also provide a lot of direct resources to congregations through consulting services, part of which we call community engagement services, which help congregations think about how they're using space, how they're engaging their community, and also how they're taking care of their buildings and how they can be better stewards of their buildings. We also help congregations with fundraising and in consulting services where we help them think about strategic visioning, feasibility studies for capital campaigns, and executing capital campaigns. One of the key things I'll just say about that before coming back to talking about Immaculate Conception is that our approach to community fundraising for historic houses of worship is really based on an approach that is community wide. We believe very strongly, and we try to make this case everywhere we go, that these buildings matter to the wider community. You know, Immaculate Conception doesn't just matter to Catholics. It just doesn't matter just to Italian American Catholics in Bloomfield. It actually matters to lots of people beyond that particular community because it's a landmark, because it's an important building, because it embodies rich and important history, and it has great potential to be an asset for the community. And many other sacred places across the country are like that. And so utilizing or leveraging that case, we help congregations in partnership with their community develop the resources, the financial resources they need to take care of these places and ensure their future. Coming back to talking about this property, I think one of the key things to always think about with adaptive reuse of historic houses of worship, especially in thinking about uses that will benefit the community, is to take a really good and strong look at the market or the neighborhood and the region. What is needed? So I think the first thing is to think about the assets of the property. What does it potentially lend itself towards? And how do you answer a question like that? Well, one of the ways you answer a question about what new purposes a building can serve, what we in preservation might call more compatible uses, for instance, would be to actually bring community leaders into the picture. So we strongly advise several steps towards this thinking in a book that we produced, and I actually helped write, which is a guide to community-minded transition for historic houses of worship. This is a resource that was created specifically to help both religious leaders and religious communities and community leaders think about how to find new uses and make those work for historic houses of worship, as well as the process of a congregation considering and discerning whether or not it was the time to ask these big questions about the future of their building and their role as stewards of a building. But you really need to understand what a community needs and how a building can meet those needs, and whether or not how those two things come together. St. James, the St. James Place project in Great Barrington in Berkshire County, Massachusetts is one example that I worked on personally. This was an Episcopal parish that had closed, and it was a lovely mid-19th century Gothic revival campus. And there was some initial idea about it being a performing arts center in the culture-rich area of the Berkshires. And so what our work looked at specifically was, well, how does this building fit into that larger market of performing cultural and performing arts spaces? What's different about this place versus the existing venues for culture and arts? And so to answer that question, we had to go to the community and have a town hall, bring together culture leaders in small groups and one-on-one interviews, think about the market that was there and the potential ability to actually have sustainable use that could generate the resources for the annual care and maintenance of the building. So it really needs to be a community-wide conversation. It really needs allies and advocates from the community from several disciplines who can think critically and also bring the important information about what does the community need? What are the assets and strengths of the community? And how can this building, a building like this, for instance, fit into that in order to meet new needs? So that's very, very, very key. Another key, maybe challenging or difficult issue is this issue around iconography. It may strike some folks as bewildering or different to think about this issue around how the Roman Catholic Church approaches the issue of religious iconography in buildings that are closed. It's a different principle at work, and it's a religious principle, and it's a very old religious principle. Sacred objects since the Middle Ages in Christianity have when they're no longer able to be used, there's always been a sense that they need to be destroyed, respectfully destroyed, because they no longer can fulfill that sacred purpose. And this is somewhat similar. There's also another issue too, which is safeguarding sacred properties and sacred images from potential misuse or the perception of misuse. I think it was really great that Greg brought up the example of the brew pub works. That was actually an example I was going to mention because I think that while it seemed at first such a great, and in some ways still is a great example of preservation reuse, there were a lot of folks in the religious community that felt it was ultimately insensitive. And that insensitivity has blossomed in some ways into a much more vigilant approach to the guidelines and regulations of the church. So when the archdioceses are enforcing or talking about their own guidelines for what happens to sacred art and sacred buildings after they're closed and no longer fit or no longer used for their purpose, they are actually enforcing locally canons or ecclesiastical law that is essentially universal in the church about the disposition of religious property. I want to give an example somewhat nearby of St. Charles Borromeo Seminary. This is a massive property just on the outside of the city of Philadelphia in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, which is being sold, and it's being sold to a healthcare system. And so it'll be reused in part for healthcare. This property is located in Lower Merion Township. Again, the very same issue around stained glass, religious statues and carvings on buildings, as well as texts too, because I'm very keen to remember what Greg mentioned about the I believe in that beautiful mosaic reredos as religious texts. The initial response to the Archdiocese was that essentially most of these needed to be removed. However, they worked through a very long and very detailed process with the Lower Merion Historic Preservation Commission, with the assistance of some cultural resource professionals from, I think, Beyer Binder Bell, to actually look at each of these features individually and look at the Archdiocese regulations and the canon law of the church and what needed to happen, and then look at the very specific features. I mention this because there may be an initial response that is sort of a universalized boilerplate approach, but in a friendly atmosphere of cooperation, there may be possibility to look at individual elements of the building. It does not mean that every single thing is necessarily able to be saved, but that the Archdiocese may, depending on a well thought out approach, consider some compromises on some of the features of the building. And I think that's really important. And an air of partnership is really key, as well as, I think in the case of St. Charles Borromeo, the new use was really critical here. The use of the property actually also in the Catholic tradition has a lot to bear on how the building is treated by the church after it's closed. So healthcare, for instance, is the kind of use, it's not a sacred use necessarily, but is a kind of nonprofit use that's focused on the well-being and care of people that is somewhat aligned. A more commercial use or something like, for instance, a brewery gets farther away. And so that there's less, the church is sort of less comfortable with religious iconography being left in an environment where the new use is sort of more is farther away from what the church does. If I'm making myself clear, and I hope that does come across clearly here. So I just want to make sure that folks understand that there's all these different kinds of scenarios there. So I think, if we're talking about what's really key, also just to summarize, I think, Greg pointed out, you have to understand the condition of the building and what it needs in terms of investment. You have to have a coalition of community partners from various disciplines who understand what does the building naturally lend itself to, and then also what does this community need? Who are the major assets and players around us? And what is a sustainable new use that can generate resources for preservation and stewardship of the space, and also make sense in our community. And then thirdly, working collaboratively with the current entity like the Archdiocese with a clear vision of a new use that makes sense and is community minded, and then a carefully thought out plan that considers each element of sacred art. I think something like the Reredos, for instance, I don't know how the Archdiocese might take the I believe, but the I believe is probably meant to reference the creed of the church, the Nicene Creed, which is recited during the Mass, but it could also be more generic. So there may be more leeway about that. Does that have to leave? Also, the imagery in that Reredos is more generalized. I think there's some angels, but it's very abstracted. A window, I know those two great nave windows are another great example. The Adam and Eve window, again, it's a little bit more generic. It's a general Bible story. And also removal of Dal de Verre glass is extremely complicated because you essentially have to destroy those windows to remove them. I mean, can't really be totally removed and sold off. It's not something that can happen with Dal de Verre. But the other window with Christ and the second coming is a very specific religious iconography of Christ. And again, depending on what that potential new use is, an entity like the diocese may or may not be as comfortable with that iconography being there. So lots of different kinds of things to think about, but it sounds like there's a really wonderful coalition of people who understand the value and can work together really to find what that new beneficial and community use is, and collaborate with the Archdiocese to make sure that as much as can be sustained, that adds to that richness and beauty of that building can remain. So thanks for inviting me, and I'm glad that I got to share a little bit. So I appreciate that.
Thank you, Joshua and Greg. Greg, did you have anything did Joshua get your mind working here and you wanted to add a few more comments?
I'm going to be buying that book.
I believe Saber put a link to that book in the chat. It is available on your website.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep.
I did want to add that any of the participants who have an association with the church, if they have any further information or photos, I'd very much appreciate any of those materials, which they could be emailed to me.
We'll make sure you guys are in touch with each other. There are a couple questions in the chat. The first thing is will this presentation be available? It is being recorded, and those of you who have signed up for it, whether you could make it or not, will receive an email letting you know when this is ready to be viewed. There is a question, a very nice compliment for a great presentation, Greg, but the question is, are the connecting walkways behind the mosaic wall to the priest preparation rooms still there? Those were the days when the priest retired after the service to the back dressing room and didn't go to the lobby to greet parishioners after Mass. How things have changed.
Yeah, they are still there. They're actually enclosed now.
Those are the
Greg,
only
would that be
questions.
the sacristy, Greg? That would that would be the sacristy, right?
Yeah, from the sacristy,
Right.
behind the school, there was a like a covered walkway, and that was enclosed to to get to the priest's residence. So.
The next question, does anyone know the condition of the school building and how might it affect adaptive reuse of the property?
I do not know the condition. I would say one complication of reusing the church is that it shares mechanical systems. The boiler is shared between the school and the church, which presents yet another challenge.
Okay, those are the only questions we have. So you obviously did an amazing job. This was wonderful, Greg. I mean, it was so great. Your photos and your 3D illustrations that you did were just so helpful in getting a sense of how this amazing building looks, especially, and that the photo that shows from the altar so that you can see the two stained glass windows is just like so impressive. It's just really great.
Yeah.
Brittany, did you have
Thank you.
anything?
Oh, I'll just second Mindy. Thank you, Greg, for, especially the excellent technical illustrations. Your professional background brought so much to your perspective of the structure, along with the archival material and the contemporary photographs, which are just stunning. Our audience with the Pittsburgh Modern Committee and Preservation Pittsburgh has expressed so much, interest and often curiosity in this site, because many of them happen by, but have never experienced it firsthand. So it's just those materials are a very powerful tool in understanding the kind of design value in detail, and really appreciate Joshua's points about a strategic approach to an issue such as this in that kind of multi-tiered way. And we just look forward to continuing to partner with Preservation Pennsylvania to kind of connect, community leaders and feedback and advocates in tandem as we explore next steps where possible here. And I just had one comment. When we shared some of the images of the interior on our social media, one international follower mentioned Felix Candela, the architect in Mexico City, and I thought it was a very good point. And I've actually experienced firsthand some of those, especially his church interiors. So he did use and apply thin concrete shell in the kind of vaulted roof, combining it with beautiful and modern stained glass. And they're such moving, and to your point, Greg, these really expressions, very dynamic interiors. So I just wanted to mention that because I appreciated the comparison, and it might be helpful to, put in context the unique, as you described so well, the Belly brothers approach to this specific style of modernism and why this interior, I think, is so powerful. But it left me wondering if they had exposure to those international gestures because Candela's spaces would have been done before this, but not much before, maybe mid to the end of the 1950s. So just a comment
That's
to
interesting.
put out there. Yeah. But thank you again.
Thank you.
There was a question about any opportunity to tour the church, which has always been my question as well. So we'll have to work on that and see if we can provide any opportunity. There was a question, how were the ceramic walls installed?
I believe they were 12 by 12 inch sort of tiles, and each tile had sort of hundreds of little circles. And then that was applied to the wall, you know, many, many times over. There are probably 100,000 of those little tiles. It's really amazing.
And then one last question was the issue of making it handicap accessible.
Yeah, it does not have an elevator, and the restrooms are in the basement. So that is a challenge, but the vestibule and narthex are relatively large. I think a creative architect could find a good solution.
And there's one last question, and I think this pretty much summarizes where we will end. When will we know the outcome of the church? We don't know the outcome of the church. You said that an answer from the Vatican is expected within the month.
Yeah.
Did you mention that?
And the next from Linda Vaca, who's heading up that that request, said that she expected it within the next month or so.
Okay. And then if the answer is no, that the church will not reopen, then we're all going to be working to help guide the future use of this church. We have our work cut out for us.
We do.
Thank you, Greg and Joshua and Brittany, for
Thanks,
this
Joshua.
great webinar. And we will have this up available for you to watch in just a couple of days. So thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate your support of this church. This is an at-risk property that as soon as I saw the first picture, I was already in favor of listing it, because the idea of losing this church is certainly would be a huge loss for Pittsburgh and for the story of all of the amazing artisans that worked on this beautiful, beautiful building. So thank you all for joining us, and have a great night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.